Good morning. Good to see everybody here this morning. We hope that you've had a good holiday with your family. I know we have some still traveling for that, and we have some here that are visiting that have been traveling. So we thank you for spending time to be here with us this morning, and we're very excited to get into the text this morning. If you have your Bibles, you can turn with me to 2 Kings chapter 22. 2 Kings chapter 22. I don't know if you've checked your calendar, but if you haven't, next week we have a big holiday, the last one of this stretch of holidays, and that is the New Year. I always enjoy the New Year. It's a time for us to reset our clocks, reset our goals, and think about how we are going to do things better this next year than we have this current year. So we put the things in the past and we move forward. It's also a time that we set goals. We call them New Year's resolutions. And I wouldn't be a true biblical preacher if I didn't do a lesson around New Year's resolutions, right? So we're going to talk about kind of adjacent to New Year's resolutions, this idea of turning a new page, starting a new chapter in our lives and moving on to something in the future. Now, I've had you turn to 2 Kings chapter 22 because this is a perfect Old Testament text of somebody taking a less than perfect situation and turning it to the positive. Now, we're not going to be able to read this morning every verse out of 2 Kings 22, but I want to give you a little bit of background into the context of 2 Kings 22. This is the beginning and the first big change in the reign of King Josiah. Now, who was King Josiah? If you've studied the Old Testament before, you probably know him as the youngest king in Judah's history. So he started ruling when he was 8 years old. But in the 18th year of his rule, so that would put him about age 26, he asked some men to go to the temple. Now, the temple at this point in Judah has been completely overrun with idolatry. And it has fallen apart. It is decayed. And Josiah says to his chief over that area, his chief priest Hilkiah, he says, I want you to take some money from the temple, from the collection, from the taxes and stuff, and I want you to repair the temple. That's all he says. Now, during the repairs, Hilkiah finds a book in the temple. I don't know if it's in a side storage room or hidden away in a clay pot. He finds this book, he opens it up, and it intrigues him. It's the book of the law. And so Hilkiah gives it to a guy named Shaphan, and Shaphan takes it to the king Josiah, this 26-year-old, and he says, hey, we got to talk about this book. We found this book. And so they begin to read the book together, and right there in the middle of hearing the words of the law, Josiah stops dead in his tracks. And he tears his clothes, and he begins to mourn, and he says, go inquire for me. Figure out what I need to do to make this right, because according to this book that was found in the temple, we aren't living correctly. Now, Josiah, upon hearing the words of the book of the law, is going to make a huge reform. He is going to, starting in chapter 23, really crack down on idolatry in Judah. He does away with idolatry. He takes down all the altars. He crumbles them up. He burns them. There was altars all through Judah, whether it was to Molech or to Baal. They were sacrificing children to these false gods. And Josiah does away with all of them. Now, what can we take away from this text of 2 Kings chapter 22? Well, the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to Josiah turning this new page, not only in his personal life, but in the life of all of those in Judah, is that we've got to talk about the excuses. Anytime you are going to start something new, it is so easy to bargain with yourself and make excuses as to why you are not going to change or why you're not going to change something right now. You know how many thousands of days I've said I was going to start a diet tomorrow? A lot. I've been wanting to do a 7-day fast for a long time. And I'll get like 2 hours into it, and then I'll get like really tired, and I'm just like, man, you know what? I'm going to have a steak, but tomorrow I'll start my 7-day fast. It's an excuse. Well, I didn't sleep good tonight, so I would go to the gym, but maybe tomorrow. Well, Josiah had a bag full of excuses he could have used. Now, keep in mind, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, right? And he's 26 when they find the book of the law. He could have said anything. Well, I'm young. I don't really concern myself with spiritual stuff. The people like idolatry. Just let them do their thing. Don't bother me. He could have used age as an excuse. In fact, if you look at chapter 22 and verse number 1, it tells us about the age. He was 8 years old when he began to reign. Okay, I don't know how much you know about 8-year-olds, but they don't know much about running a country. So, of course, there was going to be people in charge helping him along the way. But those advisors, whoever they may have been, were not positive, influences in his life. So he has to make this decision of his own accord, because in the 18th year of King Josiah, that's when they find the book of the law. Now, the second glaring excuse that Josiah could have used is his family history. And this is where you back up into chapter 21. Now, I want to introduce to you two men. Number one is Manasseh. That's chapter 21 and verse number 2. And really all of chapter 21 talks about how terrible not only Ammon was, that is Josiah's father, but how bad Manasseh was, Josiah's grandfather. But speaking of Manasseh, the grandfather, in chapter 21 and verse number 2, it says, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. So granddad was a good influence or a bad influence? Bad influence. Okay, then his own father, Ammon, speaking of Ammon in verse 20 of chapter 21, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as Manasseh his father had done. Not only in this moment could Josiah have threw his hands up and said, I'm too young for this, I'm too busy for this, I'm not really concerned about a book you found. Thanks, but no thanks. But he has 2 generations of negative influences in his family. You know how strange that is to break that kind of a mold? You take someone who has never heard the true name of God before. He has been steeped in and raised around idolatry. All he knows is these idols. My dad, that's all he followed. His dad, that's all he followed. Naturally, in a human's perspective, I'm just going to do what they did. Things were okay for them. Could they have been better? Sure, but I don't really know if this book is the solution. But Josiah doesn't lean on excuses. He doesn't make excuses because of his age, because of his advisors. He doesn't make excuses for his father. He doesn't make excuses for Manasseh. But when he finds the book of the law, he says, this is what it says and this is what we're doing. And those two things do not match. And he, in that moment, betrays, if you will, in a righteous way, he betrays his family's history. That's why I love Josiah. And if it wasn't for my little cousin, I've got a little cousin named Josiah, I would have loved that name for a boy. But he is an awesome example of knowing what to stand up for and not being afraid of those around you to take a stand and say, we're not going to go down that path. Now, in the second place, not only could Josiah have used excuses, but I want you to consider that Josiah goes back to the basics. Now, in that moment when Shaphan and Hilkiah are sitting down with the book of the law and they're reading it to Josiah, Josiah doesn't know much about God's mercy. He doesn't know much about God's sovereignty. He doesn't know much about the priestly order and everything that priests are required to do. He doesn't know much about the story of redemption through the Old Testament leading up into... He doesn't know any of that. Now, one excuse I see we use quite often is we'll say, well, I just don't know enough. I don't know enough, and it's confusing. There's parts of the Bible that I've never studied before. Maybe you're intimidated by certain books. Maybe you feel like you are inadequate to study because you don't know the original Greek or the original Hebrew. That's not where Josiah started. He started at the basics of, here's what I'm told to do, here's what I'm doing. We will build from there. It is a launching point, not to be a deterring point of, well, I just don't know enough, therefore I'm just going to keep in the way I'm going because I know a lot more about idolatry. I don't know about this God figure. I don't know about this book of the law, so I'm just going to hang in here and keep at what I know. But he goes back to the very basics. And in fact, if you consider, in chapter 10 and 11, it says, Shaphan the secretary told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. Shaphan read it before the king, and when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. He used logic to open up his eyes and say, that's what it says to do. This is what I'm doing. Those two things don't match. And then he further inquires in verse 13, go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and all of Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us because of our fathers. They have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. Now, a lot in verse 13, but he's going to learn more as he goes. But he just says, hey, figure out what we're supposed to do. And they do. They go and they talk to a prophetess and figure out what they're supposed to do with this book of the law. But also, I want to point out that although the main offenders of leaving this book of the law in the dust is his forefathers, Manasseh and Ammon, he says that because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, he also takes personal responsibility. In the first part of verse 13, he says, go inquire of the Lord for me and for the people. Although the problem started with his forefathers, latter part of verse 13, he says, this is our problem now. This is our problem now. And then he ends it by saying, all that is written concerning us. He understands the personal responsibility to make things right. Now, that's another excuse we could get into and say, well, that's not the way my mom and my dad raised me. That's not I wasn't raised in this kind of church. I was raised in a different kind of church. And we kind of just shove the blame off on other people. But instead of doing that, he says, yes, my father started it, but this is our problem. Go speak to somebody. Figure out somebody who can guide us in the right direction. Because I need it, and the people need it. Because this story is about us. So he goes back to the basics. He says, I don't know it all. I'm not professing to know it all, but let's find out. So he opens up the book and he begins to study. And that's the second important thing about turning a new page, is not focusing on the hardest things that you don't know, but let's build on it. In the third place, he was consistent. And this is where we get into chapter 23, and I want you to take a look at 2 verses in chapter 23. And starting in verse number 2, it says, and the king went up after hearing what he was supposed to do with the book of the law. He went up to the house of the Lord, and with him all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the prophets and all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. So it starts with his example of, hey, we're going to meet together and we're going to talk about what we found. And so they read it for all the people. And the very next verse, I love the phraseology in this verse. And the king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, and to perform the words of this covenant that are written in this book. And all the people joined in the covenant. Now, isn't that a wonderful story? Isn't that a great example of how we can start anew, start fresh, and move forward? It is. Now, the lesson's not over. I know that the slides are over, and you might be thinking, wow, we're going to get out of here quick. No. It would not be a New Year's sermon if you got out of here quick. No. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 3. Let's do some personal application. Hebrews chapter 3. We're going to start in verse number 12. Now, turning the attention away from Josiah and 2 Kings chapter 22, we need to focus on what we can take away from this topic of turning a new page and starting afresh. Now, Hebrews chapter 3, we're going to start speaking about our excuses, maybe. And start in verse number 12. It says, take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you, an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. Let's stop right there before we get to verse 13. What is the context of the book of Hebrews? Well, in the book of Hebrews, there's a strong emphasis about not abandoning God. See, when we get to Hebrews 10 and verse 24 and 25, which I think we referenced just a few weeks ago, but it talks about not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together as the manner of some is. Why did he say that? Because a lot of people were kind of Christians, but they also partook in idol worship, and they were abandoning God. They were leaving the faith. And so the Hebrews writer here in verse 12 says, I don't want any of you to have a evil, unbelieving heart. Verse 13, but exhort or encourage one another every day as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ if we indeed hold our original confidence firm to the end. As it is said, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Today if you hear His voice, do not harden your heart. I know, what is today, the 28th? It would be very convenient for any one of us to say, well, you know, I have not had a good spiritual track record over the last 365 days, but I'm going to start working on myself on January 1st. That's a good time to do it. Why would we wait? What is our excuse? What exactly justifies living in a state of sin? What justifies living apart from God? Josiah certainly didn't look at his excuses and say, well, it's my age, it's my family history. He went straight for what needed to be fixed. Why, if you know that there is something in your life that needs to be changed, why would you wait a few more days? You know, if you're really serious about changing something in your life, whether that be with your health or with your finances, if you've started to make excuses and to bargain with yourself, you're not serious about it. If you say, well, I really need to get my health in check, but I'm going to wait until this, you're really not serious about it. And it's time for us as people of God to take our spiritual walk and our spiritual journey seriously. Don't make excuses. Don't bargain with yourself, because that shows God that you're not really that interested in changing when it's convenient for me. How many times did Christ approach people in the New Testament and say, come and follow me? And what were the list of excuses? We have the rich young ruler. He said, what do I need to do to be perfect? You know, I've been keeping most of the law my whole life. He says, go and sell all that you have. But he went away sorrowful because he had a lot of things. That was his excuse. To others, he said, come and follow me. Oh, well, you know, I have to bury my father first. Come and follow me. Well, you know, I just married a wife. I would, but got this lady, you know. There's a million things you could use as an excuse to push God off until later. Not one of them are justified. Today, if you have heard His voice, do not harden your hearts. I want you to also consider 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. Let's look at the first 5 verses here about getting back to the basics. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and slander. Like newborn infants, long for the spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation. What I love here is where he says you have to grow into it. Now we understand that if you remain on a steady diet of the milk of the word, you will be spiritually weak. But you got to start somewhere. So he says you need the milk first so you can grow up into salvation. Verse 3, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good, if you are intrigued, if you yearn for more spiritual knowledge, verse 4, as you come to Him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves like living stones are being, second word about growth, built up, being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Now, that was the first 5 verses there of 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. And again, I want to turn our attention to our own personal walks. You're not going to know it all at first. Yes, you may have been a member of the church for years. You may have been a professed Christian for years. And you may look at your spiritual knowledge now and say, well, I don't know anything about this book. I don't know anything about this concept. Get after it. Go do it. Now, it's going to take a little bit at a time. It's not that you're going to wake up one morning and know it all, but you got to start somewhere. Go back to the very basics and start building from there. Start growing from there. The lack of education or the lack of knowledge on a certain subject is not an excuse not to do it or not to learn. At one point, every great scientist, every, rocket scientist or brain surgeon, they knew nothing about their field of study, not a thing. There was at one point where they were all sitting in grade school learning 2 + 2 = 4, but they grew into their fields. You take somebody who has experienced and done it for 30, 40 years, they know a lot more than when they started, but they were okay with that learning process. Now, you may have been a Christian for a long time, but you don't know anything about God. You don't know what His will is for you, and you really want to know more. Use that as a fuel for the fire. Okay, we're going to start off down here with the spiritual milk, but our goal at the end of 2026 is to be a little bit deeper in the Word, to be a little bit more towards meat than milk. And then our goal for 2027 is to be even better, and our goal for 2028 and so forth and so on. We have to start somewhere. But kicking back, throwing our feet up and saying, well, I just don't know about the book of Revelation, therefore I'm just not going to study it. You know how many times I've heard that? That book it scares me. I'm a little confused by that, so I'm just not going to study it. That is no excuse. Say, I'm not going to know everything day one, but I'm going to start somewhere and I'm going to start moving forward. The last thing I want you to consider with me is 2 Corinthians chapter 6. I appreciate that reading that was done just a little bit ago. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And we're going to read just the first couple verses here, and then the lesson will be yours. I want you to start with me in verse number 1. Paul says, working together with Him, then we appeal to you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For He says, in a favorable time I've listened to you, and in a day of salvation I have helped you. And Paul is urging and begging the Corinthians here. Last part of that verse, behold, now is the favorable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Friends, I know that in a few days we're going to talk about New Year's resolutions and changing things in our life that we feel like they need to be changed. But this morning, if it's just for a second, please pause. Consider your spiritual walk, where you are and where you need to be. Open the book of the law. Consider your path. Consider your spiritual journey. And ask yourself, as honestly as you can, am I where I need to be? And if the answer is no, do not let the words of our God fall on deaf ears. If you need to make a change in your life, don't wait. Don't wait until Wednesday. Today is the day of salvation. Friends, we would love to pray with you and for you if you are a child of God. That's part of our obligation and our joy to do as a church. If you are not a child of God and you are simply here for the first time and you want to inquire, what does this book of the law say concerning salvation? We'd love to sit down with you and study. Whatever your need may be, why don't you come and make it known as we stand and sing this song of encouragement.